Hey everybody, Mr. Grove here. Today we're going to talk about algae. And so these are the members of the phytoplankton aspect of protists. And so we usually think of plankton and we think of this guy right here and his obsession with the Krabby Patties. But plankton is not all little green guys with one eye. It's a very diverse group, and we have zooplankton and phytoplankton. So some eat things, those act like animals, and then some act like plants, and so that would be the phytoplankton. And so on our phytoplankton, we're going to talk about some types of algae and then the diatoms and forams today. And so diatoms, Bacillirophyta is their official name, and these are little unicellular single-cell algae with these little double shells, and so they're almost like crystals or Christmas ornaments. They produce oil. And we all know oil then is going to be a little less dense than water, so that will help them kind of glide along, and then also stay near the surface for photosynthesis, and that's where the sunlight is. And so these guys are a huge part of the food chain, and they also have uses too. I mean, we will use phytoplankton, these little silica-based crystals, then will be the gritty part of your toothpaste. And so that's going to be phytoplankton, or that's going to be the diatoms. They're good guys. They don't try and hurt us, and in fact, they're really beneficial to the environment and specifically the food chain. Another kind of phytoplankton is going to be the forams. And so forams are also little miniature shell-like plankton, in some ways maybe more animal-like, but they often get kind of lumped together with the diatoms. And the forams are going to be almost like little snail shells, little seashells, and they're very porous. They have little tiny holes all throughout. And so they will kind of live symbiotically with algae a lot of times. And so these forams have a lot of, food chain importance. But then also, we can kind of, because they're porous and they absorb things, we can kind of use them for radioactive dating to kind of get an idea on what the weather and what the climates were like at other times in the Earth's history. And so that's going to be the forams. Both good guys, nobody's trying to hurt you here, unlike the other protists like malaria and things like that. But these are some of our phytoplankton. Now for the algae, what you've all been waiting for. So typically with algae, we usually go based on color, and so that can kind of be a little loose sometimes. So we call it brown algae, but sometimes it looks more greenish than it does brown. And so there's the four types that we'll talk about are brown algae, red algae, golden algae, and green algae. And so typically with brown algae, this is going to be mostly marine, which means mostly saltwater. Really all multicellular. So brown algae, unlike many of the protists we talked about so far, is very large and makes up, lots of cells make it up. And in fact, kelp, which is a very common brown algae, can grow up to about 2 feet per day. And so in a single growing season, a kelp algae can be over 100 feet tall. So it's an incredible grower. You'd think, wow, something that grows so quickly and there's so much of it, can we use it as a food source? So we try, but sadly in our Western culture, because of the high iodine, which isn't bad, and the unusual polysaccharides, we just don't like the taste really. And so in Eastern cultures, it's a little bit more used, but it's just, we prefer our burgers and pizza over here. So one common food source that kelp is used for it's the wrappers in your sushi. So if you're a sushi fan, you've probably eaten brown algae before because that's what the sushi wrappers, the nori, is made out of. But the most important thing for brown algae and kelp would be the habitat provided by these kelp forests. These things are absolutely huge and enormous. And so they just provide amazing aquatic habitat for aquatic life to breed, hide, hunt, try and stay safe. And it's just like literally a forest underwater. So really super cool, the kelp forest, and we'll watch a couple clips later on that. Another type of algae is the red algae. And so this is a lot of variety here. So a lot of saltwater algae is red algae. But there's also some red algae in soil. There's also a really cool case where it's called watermelon snow. So in saltwater, red algae, we used to have a saltwater aquarium here at the school, and the algae wasn't the typical green tint. It would be this kind of reddish kind of slime that would get going. And so that red algae, mostly multicellular, but there were some unicellular types as well, would absorb the pigment of light that was kind of the GBIV, and would kind of reflect the red, so reflect the R and maybe a little bit of the orange as well. But that's kind of where this red algae comes from. A really cool red algae is what's called watermelon snow. And so the first time we did any hiking out in Colorado one year, we were pretty high up and there were still some snowbanks. And we noticed some of them had some pinkish tint to them. We're like, that is so bizarre. And it was, somebody told us, said, well, that's what's called watermelon snow. And we said, what? And if you go eat it, they said, go ahead and taste a little of it. It won't hurt you. So we gave it a try. And sure enough, it tasted and looked and kind of almost even smelled like watermelon. And so it was the red algae that was living in the snow that caused that. And so it has to be pretty high up. It was like 10,000 feet or higher. But that's the watermelon snow. It was a real deal. Sometimes that can actually cause a little bit of issue because red is going to absorb more than white as far as sunlight goes, and so therefore absorbing more light will heat you up. And then heating up can cause some potential snow melt. And so just kind of creating more snow melt might pose a potential environmental problem for Arctic climates then if they have watermelon snow. So that's the red algae or the rotophyta. The one we're used to is definitely the green algae. And so this is our freshwater. But we can have green algae in saltwater too. But you go to any freshwater pond, you're going to see green algae in there. You go to a freshwater aquarium like ours at school, it's always going to have that greenish tint to it. And so these are definitely the most closely related algae to plants. Some common, in the name chlorophyta, that chloro then implies the green part. So some common examples that you'd see in green algae, some of them are kind of a unicellular but yet colonial multicellular specimen, and that's going to be Volvox. And so Volvox has all these little single cells that live in a colony, and then they all have flagella, and they kind of spin together. They don't need to try and make you sick. They're photosynthetic. They make their own food, so they're just kind of doing their thing. Another one is Chlamydomonas, and so this is another little green algae. If you looked at it under the microscope, it would look a lot like the Euglena you saw. Ulva is sometimes called sea lettuce, and so that's kind of an interesting type of green algae as well that some people do eat or use in cosmetic type products. And then another really cool one, not the band name, but is Spirogyra. And so Spirogyra, the filament of chlorophyll makes this coiled spring-like spiral inside then a clear tube. And so that is how the green algae Spirogyra kind of gets its name. And again, these are all part of the plankton community, specifically the phytoplankton community, and they're all good guys. They're not trying to make you sick or get you ill. So that's the green algae, chlorophyta, and we have one last kind of algae, and this is the golden algae. And so this is, again, more oceanic, and so just kind of a little bit based on its color scheme, so it's going to be reflecting more of the yellows. And so the official name would be kind of the chrysophyta. But again, just part of our phytoplankton and is going to be part of that food chain. So very important to be able to be part of that and help keep the environment plugging along. So that is a little bit about algae. They're pretty much all good guys. Every once in a while they can get out of control and kind of bloom, which might cause some issues. But that is all the algae, and I hope that was helpful.